They told her it was an honor. They lied. You don't send a girl in a white linen shift to a dying wolf because you respect her. You send her because she's bait. At 18, Rowan was sold to the Alpha King, a man rotting from the inside out. The council called it a sacred union to save our pack. I call it a sacrifice. But what they didn't know, the lamb they sent to the slaughter had sharp teeth of her own. The river water was cold enough to make the bones in Rowan's hands ache a deep, throbbing protest against the morning chill. She ignored it, dragging the dull edge of her iron knife against the flank of a trout. Scales flew, catching the weak grey daylight like flecks of tarnished silver. Behind her, the village of Oakhaven was waking up. It didn't sound like a pack of wolves. It sounded like a graveyard clinging to life. A child coughed a wet, rattling sound from a nearby hut. It was Finn, her little brother. The winter had come early, and the elk herds had moved east, bypassing their territory entirely. Oakhaven was starving. Footsteps crunched on the frost-hardened mud. Heavy, deliberate. The sound of a man who ate meat every night. Rowan didn't look up until the shadow fell over her wooden cutting board. She wiped her bloody hands on a burlap rag, and finally raised her eyes. Elder Alden stood there. He was draped in a thick bear pelt, his silver hair braided tightly against his skull. The cold didn't seem to touch him. Men with full bellies rarely felt the frost. "Leave the fish, Rowan," Alden said. His voice was gravel and authority. "The council requires your presence in the longhouse." Rowan stared at him. She was 18. Unmated, an orphan who scraped a living mending nets and gutting whatever the hunters managed to drag in. The council did not summon girls like her unless they had broken a law, or unless they were needed. "I have 2 more to clean," she said flatly, gesturing to the meager pile of trout. "Finn needs the broth." "Finn will have a haunch of venison by nightfall," Alden replied. "If you do as you're told." That made her stop. Venison. It was a word that felt heavy on the tongue, a distant memory of better years. She looked at Alden's face. There was no warmth in his pale eyes, only a calculating grimness. A knot tightened in her stomach. She followed him up the hill. The longhouse was large and draughty, smelling of old smoke-damp wool and the nervous sweat of the men who ruled their dwindling pack. 5 elders sat at the massive oak table. They didn't look at her with respect. They looked at her the way a merchant looks at a horse before checking its teeth. "Rowan of the River," Elder Garrett began. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You are aware of the treaty with the Northern Keep. I know they own the fertile valleys." Rowan said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. "And I know they shoot our hunters if we cross the ridgeline." "They do," Garrett agreed. "King Conrad is fiercely territorial. Or he was." Alden stepped forward, standing beside her like a warden. "The king is dying, Rowan. A witch's blight. The rot has taken his legs and is climbing for his heart. His pack is on the verge of tearing itself apart to claim his seat. He needs an anchor. A mate." Rowan's heart performed a slow, painful roll in her chest. "He is an alpha king. Surely the Northern Keep has 100 high-born daughters ready to take the bite. The blight is volatile," Alden said, choosing his words with uncharacteristic care. "It taints his blood. The mating bite of a dying alpha is a chaotic thing. The 2 women his council offered did not survive the bonding. Their bodies rejected his fevered blood. They died screaming." The silence in the longhouse was absolute. A log shifted in the hearth, sending up a shower of orange sparks. Rowan looked at the men. "So you're offering him a peasant, a girl whose death won't start a war. We are offering him a survivor," Garrett corrected smoothly. "Your bloodline is old, Rowan. Coarse, perhaps, but resilient. If you survive the bite, you become queen. If you don't—" He paused, his eyes flicking away for a fraction of a second. "The Northern Keep has agreed to open the valleys to our hunters the moment you arrive. Even if you perish, Oakhaven eats. It wasn't a request. It was an execution order wrapped in a diplomatic bow. She could refuse, of course. She could scream and fight and let her wolf bare its teeth. But then she would walk back to her freezing hut, and she would watch Finn's ribs push harder against his pale skin until he stopped coughing entirely. These men were cowards. They were selling a girl to buy their own survival. She hated them with a sudden blistering intensity that tasted like copper in the back of her throat. "Venison," Rowan said softly. Alden frowned. "What? You said Finn would have venison by nightfall. I want a quarterstag delivered to my hut before I get on the wagon. I want a cord of dry wood stacked against his door, and I want it in writing that he is protected by the council until he is old enough to hunt." Garrett sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "Done. It is a small price for the salvation of the pack. It's a small price for my life." Rowan corrected him, her voice devoid of any emotion. She didn't cry. Tears were water, and she couldn't afford to waste the heat. "When do I leave? Pack whatever you wish to carry," Alden said. "The wagon is already hitched." The journey north took 3 days. It was not a grand procession. Rowan sat in the back of an unsprung wooden cart, wrapped in a coarse woolen blanket that smelled faintly of wet dog and mould. The 2 guards assigned to escort her, Brant and Miller, rode up front. They rarely spoke to her. They treated her like a fragile, doomed piece of cargo, something already dead but not yet buried. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the world bled of colour. The deep greens and browns of Oakhaven gave way to slate-grey granite and blinding white snow. The wind up here didn't just blow. It hunted. It found every gap in her clothing, slicing through the wool and biting into her skin. She spent the hours shivering, watching the jagged peaks loom larger. She didn't pray to the moon goddess. Rowan had stopped believing in divine intervention the day her parents fell through the river ice. If the goddess existed, she was a cruel, aloof spectator. On the evening of the 3rd day, the Wolf's Keep appeared through the driving sleet. It wasn't a fairy tale castle. It was a fortress of black basalt, thrusting out of the mountainside like a clenched fist. Iron braziers flared along the battlements, their flames whipping wildly in the wind. The massive wooden gates groaned open as they approached, swallowing the cart into the belly of the beast. The courtyard was chaos. Armoured men shouted over the howling wind. Massive wolves twice the size of the beasts in Oakhaven prowled between the outbuildings. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke roasting meat and something else, something sharp and sour. Fear. The pack smelled of fear. An alpha's weakness bled into his people, and this keep was terrified. Rowan was pulled from the cart by a severe-looking woman with greying hair and a jaw carved from flint. She introduced herself only as Greta, the head of the king's household. "You're too thin." Greta noted her eyes sweeping over Rowan's shivering frame. "But I suppose flesh doesn't matter, only blood. Come." Rowan was led through winding torch-lit corridors. The stone walls wept with condensation. They descended into the underbelly of the keep, arriving at a bathing chamber heated by roaring fires. 3 younger women were waiting. They didn't smile. "Strip," Greta commanded. Rowan hesitated for only a second before pulling her coarse tunic over her head. She stood naked, shivering violently, despite the heat, her arms crossed over her chest. They washed her with harsh lye soap and coarse sponges. They scrubbed her skin until it was raw and pink, scraping away the scent of the river, the fish, the mud of Oakhaven. They washed her hair with a stinging tincture of myrrh and crushed pine needles. It was a medical aggressive cleansing. They weren't preparing a bride. They were sterilizing a wound. "Does he hurt?" Rowan asked quietly as a girl roughly untangled her wet hair. Greta paused, a heavy linen towel in her hands. For a moment the severe mask slipped, revealing a profound, exhausted sorrow. "The king is in agony, girl. The blight burns his veins. He sleeps only when the poppy milk takes him, and even then he screams. She wrapped the towel around Rowan. You will not ask him questions. You will not flinch. You will offer your wrist and you will pray. Your heart is strong enough to take the poison without stopping. They dressed her in a shift of pure white linen. It was incredibly fine, softer than anything Rowan had ever touched, but it was thin. It fell to her ankles, a ghostly shroud. No jewelry, no shoes, just the white dress and her wet, dark hair falling down her back. It is time, Greta said. Walking barefoot through the cold stone halls was a grounding exercise. The freezing floor kept Rowan tethered to reality. She was not a hero. She was a transaction, a piece of meat-trading hands. But as she walked closer to the king's chambers, the sour smell of fear she had noticed in the courtyard intensified. It was mixed with a cloying, heavy scent, rotting lilies and spoiled copper, the smell of death. Two massive guards in blackened mail stood before a pair of heavy oak doors. They looked at Rowan. One of them, a man with a scarred cheek, actually lowered his eyes in pity. That scared her more than the harshness of the elders. Greta pushed the heavy doors open. The tribute from Oakhaven, my king. Rowan stepped inside. The heat in the room struck her like a physical blow. 4 massive hearths blazed, turning the cavernous chamber into an oven. The air was thick, hazy with the smoke of burning sage and incense, a desperate attempt to mask the smell of decay. There were no courtiers here, no priests, only a large, heavily carved bed, draped in dark furs, and a man sitting in a high-backed chair near the fire. King Conrad. Rowan stood by the door as it clicked shut behind her, leaving her utterly alone with him. She forced herself to look. She would not die with her eyes at the floor. He was massive. Even slumped in the chair, wrapped in a bear pelt, his frame was terrifyingly broad. But the flesh was melting off his bones. His face was a landscape of sharp, haggard angles, pale and slick with fever sweat. Thick black veins webbed up his neck, crawling toward his jawline like poison ivy. Then he opened his eyes. They were gold, a piercing, luminous amber that cut through the dim, hazy room. Despite the rot eating him alive, the sheer crushing weight of his alpha aura slammed into her. Rowan's knees buckled slightly, her inner wolf instinctively whining, pressing its belly to the dirt in the presence of an apex predator. She forced her legs to lock, staying upright through sheer willpower. Conrad stared at her. He didn't speak. His chest rose and fell in ragged, shallow breaths. They sent me a child. His voice was a rasp, like 2 stones grinding together. It was laced with exhaustion and a deep, simmering fury. I am 18, Rowan said. Her voice trembled just a fraction, and she hated herself for it. Conrad scoffed a wet, rattling sound. 18. A lifetime. You are a child, and your elders are butchers. Do you know what happens to you tonight, girl? I know, Rowan said, stepping closer to the fire. The heat felt good on her bare feet. You bite me. We bind. I die or I don't. He tilted his head, the golden eyes narrowing. You don't weep. The last one wept until she choked on it. Weeping doesn't change the outcome. She replied, her cynical pragmatism shielding her terror. My pack is starving. In exchange for me walking into this room, my brother eats tonight. Whether I walk out of it alive or in a pine box is irrelevant to the treaty. Conrad shifted in his chair, a grimace of pain flashing across his pale face. He looked at her, not as a sacrifice, but as a person. The realization seemed to tire him even further. Practical, he murmured. I suppose that is a mercy. I have no strength left for comforting hysterical brides. He reached out a hand. It was trembling, the knuckles stark white, the black veins prominent against his skin. Come here, then. Let us get this over with. Rowan crossed the room. Every step felt like wading through deep water. When she reached his chair, she didn't kneel. She stood beside him looking down at the dying king. Up close, the smell of the blight was overwhelming. It was a corruption of the blood, a magical sickness that felt completely unnatural. "Give me your wrist," he rasped. She held out her left arm. The white linen fell away, exposing her pale skin. Conrad took her hand. His grip was weak, his skin burning with a violent fever, but his thumb stroked over her pulse point. It wasn't a sexual touch, it was an assessment. He was feeling her heart race, feeling the life thrumming just beneath the surface. "It will burn," he said softly, looking up into her eyes. The anger was gone from his gaze, replaced by a profound, hollow regret. "The blight is a poison. When I bite you, my blood will mix with yours. It will feel like liquid fire. If your wolf is not strong enough to purge it, it will stop your heart within minutes." "And if I am strong enough?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Then we are bound," Conrad said. "My pack will sense an anchor. The chaos will settle, and you will be chained to a rotting corpse until I finally succumb." It was a bleak truth. No promises of a happily ever after, no romanticizing the trauma. "Then bite me," Rowan said, locking her jaw. "And let's see what I'm made of." Conrad pulled her wrist to his mouth. His eyes flashed from amber to the glowing, monstrous gold of his wolf. His jaw unhinged slightly, his canines elongating sharp and bone-white against his pale lips. He didn't hesitate. He sank his teeth into the tender flesh over her vein. Rowan didn't scream. She inhaled sharply, a violent hiss through her teeth as pain exploded up her arm. He was right. It wasn't just the physical puncture of the teeth, it was what poured into her. Fire. Black, agonizing fire. It surged up her veins, a creeping, corrosive acid that hit her shoulder, then her chest, and slammed into her heart. Her knees finally gave out. She collapsed against the arm of his chair, her free hand gripping the coarse fur of his pelt. Conrad held her wrist tight, his eyes closed, as the magical bond began to forge itself in blood. The room spun. The roaring of the fires faded into a deafening buzz in her ears. Rowan felt her own wolf rise up, thrashing blindly in the dark against the invading poison, fighting a desperate, violent war within her own veins. She squeezed her eyes shut, grinding her teeth, as the darkness began to pull her under her last conscious thought, wondering if Finn had gotten his venison. Rowan did not wake up to gentle sunlight or the soft singing of birds. She woke up to the smell of burnt copper and the overwhelming sensation that she had been dragged behind, a galloping horse over a bed of jagged rocks. She breathed. The air tasted heavy, dry. It took 3 agonizing attempts to pry her eyelids open. Her eyelashes were crusted with dried sweat. The cavernous chamber was dimly lit, the 4 massive hearths reduced to glowing, sullen embers. The oppressive heat from before had broken, replaced by a damp, creeping chill that settled deep into her bones. She was not on the floor where she had collapsed. She was lying in the center of the massive, fur-draped bed. Her white linen shift clung to her damp skin. "Don't move too quickly. Your wolf is still repairing the tearing in your veins." The voice came from the shadows near the window. "Conrad." Rowan turned her head. The motion sent a spike of pure, blinding agony driving through her skull. She hissed, curling her fingers into the thick pelt beneath her. Her left arm felt completely numb, save for a localized, throbbing heat at her wrist. She lifted her arm to inspect the damage. The bite mark was not a neat, romantic crescent of teeth. It was a brutal, jagged puncture wound. The skin around it was bruised a violent, necrotic purple, and thin black veins spider-webbed out from the broken flesh, creeping halfway up her forearm before fading into her pale skin. It looked like a brand. It felt like a curse. "I'm alive!" Rowan managed to croak. Her throat felt lined with crushed glass. "You are!" Conrad agreed. He stepped out of the shadows. He looked worse, if that were possible. The fever sweat had dried on his pale face, leaving his skin looking like stretched parchment over a skull. He leaned heavily on a thick wooden cane, his knuckles bone white. Yet as he looked at her, the frantic, panicked edge to his scent, the sour tang of a dying alpha losing his grip on his pack, was muted. Rowan pushed herself up on her right elbow, ignoring the wave of nausea that rolled through her stomach. She looked at him with hollow, exhausted eyes. "Did Oakhaven get the treaty?" Conrad paused. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his haggard features. "You wake up with my poison in your veins carrying the mark of a rotting king, and your first question is about a hunting treaty." "My brother can't eat a crown," Rowan said flatly. "Did they get the valley access?" "A raven was sent at dawn," Conrad replied, leaning slightly more on his cane. "Your elders have their hunting grounds. Your brother has his venison. The bargain is struck." Rowan let her head fall back against the heavy pillows. The relief didn't feel like joy. It felt like a heavy stone sliding out of her chest, leaving a cold, empty cavity in its wake. She had done it. She had survived the impossible, and Finn would live through the winter. "Now what?" she asked the ceiling. "Now," Conrad said, dragging a heavy wooden chair closer to the bed. He sat down with a suppressed grunt of pain, the sound tight and ugly in the quiet room. "Now you realize what you have tethered yourself to." He reached out and tapped a finger against his own chest right over his heart. Then he pointed at her. Rowan felt it then. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a slow, creeping awareness. Beneath the throbbing in her head and the ache in her bones, there was a new sensation. A hum. It felt like a thick, rusted iron chain hooked directly into her ribcage, pulling taut. On the other end of that chain was him. She could feel his pain. It was a dull, constant roar, like a distant waterfall of agony that never stopped flowing. She could feel the icy numbness in his legs, the agonizing burn of the blight eating at his magic. It made her gasp, her hand flying to her own chest. "It's overwhelming at first," Conrad said, his voice stripped of its commanding rumble. He just sounded tired. "The bond is a two-way conduit. I am anchoring my deteriorating magic to your healthy life force. You are stabilizing me, keeping the rot from consuming my mind. But in return, you feel the echo of my decay." Rowan stared at him, her chest heaving as she tried to compartmentalize the phantom pain. "You feel like a corpse," Conrad offered a bleak, humorless smile. "I am a corpse, Rowan of Oakhaven. I am just taking a remarkably long time to die." He leaned forward, his golden eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in them was staggering. "My pack is terrified. A frightened pack is a dangerous pack. Without a mate, without an anchor, my aura was fracturing. They could smell my weakness. They were preparing to tear each other to pieces for the right to challenge me. And now they smell you," Conrad said. "They smell a complete bond. They smell stability. It will buy us time." "Time for what?" Rowan asked, her cynicism biting through the haze of pain. "For you to die quietly instead of loudly, for them to wait a month before they kill me, and take the throne anyway." Conrad's eyes flashed. A brief, sudden surge of alpha dominance rolled through the room, heavy and suffocating. But it faded just as quickly, leaving him looking smaller. "Time," Conrad corrected, his voice hardening into flint, "to find the witch who cursed me. Time to cure this blight before it finishes the job. You did not just buy your brother's life, Rowan. You bought mine." The heavy oak doors groaned open before Rowan could respond. Greta marched into the room, her face a mask of severe efficiency. She carried a tray laden with a steaming bowl of broth, a loaf of dark bread, and a pewter goblet. She stopped short when she saw Rowan sitting up. The older woman's eyes dropped to the blackened, jagged bite mark on Rowan's wrist. For a fraction of a second, Greta's rigid posture faltered. "She held," Conrad said quietly, looking at Greta. Praise the goddess! Greta whispered, her voice cracking. She quickly recovered her composure, marching to the bedside table and setting the tray down with a loud clatter. You need to eat. The bond burns calories like a wildfire. If you don't eat, your body will start consuming its own muscle to feed his magic. Rowan looked at the dark, thick stew. It smelled of venison root vegetables and rich marrow. Her stomach violently contracted, a sudden ravenous hunger ripping through her. She didn't wait for a spoon. She picked up the bowl with trembling hands and drank straight from the rim. The broth was scalding, but she didn't care. It was life. Conrad watched her eat, a strange, unreadable expression on his gaunt face. Eat quickly, he said, rising slowly from his chair. The effort made the rusted chain in Rowan's chest give a violent yank. She winced, swallowing a chunk of meat whole. Why? She asked, wiping her mouth with the back of her uninjured hand. Because tonight, Conrad said, turning towards the hearth, you are going to meet the council. We must show them that their king is anchored, and that his queen is not a frightened peasant, but a wolf strong enough to swallow poison and ask for seconds. Greta did not let her wear the white shift. That is the dress of a sacrifice, Greta said, tossing the linen garment onto the embers of the fire. You are the queen now. You will dress like it. They outfitted her in a gown of heavy dark green wool, embroidered at the collar with the silver wolf of the northern keep. It was beautiful, but it felt like armor. The fabric was thick, designed to keep out the brutal mountain cold, and the cut was strict. It covered her completely, right up to her throat, save for her hands. Greta took a leather bracer studded with silver and fastened it securely over Rowan's left wrist. It covered the jagged, blackened bite mark entirely. They will smell the bond, Greta explained, tightening the leather straps. But they do not need to see the necrosis. A pack respects strength. They do not need to see the physical toll the king's rot is taking on you. Rowan looked at herself in a polished silver mirror. The girl from Oakhaven was gone. In her place stood a stranger with hollow cheeks, dark circles under her eyes, and a posture rigidly held together by stubbornness and spite. I look like I'm going to a funeral, Rowan noted. You are going to a war council, Greta corrected flatly. Funerals are much more relaxed. Conrad was waiting for her in the corridor. He was dressed in a dark tunic and heavy furs, the crown of the northern keep a brutalist ring of twisted iron and silver resting on his brow. He looked imposing, terrifying even until Rowan focused on the hum of the tether between them. Through the bond, she could feel the trembling in his calves. She could feel the monumental, agonizing effort it took for him to simply stand upright without his cane. He was projecting an aura of lethal command, burning his limited reserves of energy to cast a shadow of his former self. Take my arm, he instructed. Rowan stepped beside him and looped her arm through his. The moment they touched the bond flared the rusted iron chain pulling tight. Conrad shifted his weight, subtly leaning against her. To anyone watching, it looked like a king leading his new mate. To Rowan, it felt like holding up a collapsing building. Do not speak unless spoken to by the elders, Conrad murmured as they walked slowly toward the great hall. Do not bare your neck, no matter how much their auras press against yours. If you show submission, they will tear you apart. I spent my childhood gutting fish in freezing water to feed my brother, Rowan said, keeping her eyes fixed forward. I am not intimidated by old men in fancy chairs. Conrad let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't turned into a wet cough. Good. The great hall was vast, supported by massive stone pillars carved to resemble howling wolves. 2 long tables flanked a central aisle packed with the elite of the northern keep. Warriors in boiled leather, wealthy merchants draped in velvet, and the Beta bloodlines the aristocrats of the pack. The noise was deafening. 100 conversations bouncing off the stone walls. But the moment the heavy doors opened and Conrad stepped over the threshold, the silence fell like a guillotine. Rowan felt the weight of 200 eyes slam into her. The collective scent of the room shifted instantly. Curiosity, suspicion, and threading through it all the sharp, undeniable scent of challenge. Conrad walked slowly. He set the pace, forcing the entire room to wait on his agonizingly measured steps. Rowan matched his stride, holding him steady, her face a mask of total indifference. They reached the dais at the far end of the hall. 2 heavy wooden thrones sat before a roaring fire. Conrad released her arm, turning to face the room. He didn't sit. "My pack." Conrad's voice rolled over the silent hall. It was raspier than it once was, but it carried the undeniable, crushing weight of an alpha. "The chaos ends today. I have taken a mate. The bond is sealed. The anchor holds." A murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't cheering. It was the sound of 100 calculating minds reassessing their political strategies in real time. A man stepped out from the front row of the tables. He was built like a siege engine, massive shoulders straining against a leather tunic. A jagged white scar cut through his thick red beard. "An anchor, my king." The man's voice was loud, echoing slightly. He didn't sound disrespectful, but he didn't sound deferential either. He sounded like a man testing the ice before stepping onto a frozen lake. "Hendrik." Conrad acknowledged, his voice dangerously low. "You have a question. A concern my king shared by the vanguard." Hendrik said, placing his large hands on his belt. He looked directly at Rowan. His eyes were cold, assessing her like a disappointing cut of meat. "We were told the tribute from Oakhaven was a peasant girl, an unmated youth. 2 high-born females of the keep failed to survive your condition. We merely wonder if this frail thing is truly strong enough to anchor the keep, or if we are simply postponing the inevitable." Hendrik let out a low, rumbling growl, letting his beta aura push forward. It was a deliberate physical pressure in the room, designed to force a weaker wolf to break eye contact, to look down. Rowan felt the pressure hit her. Her inner wolf snarled, but it was battered from the blight, exhausted from the bonding. Her instinct was to shrink back. But then she felt the rusted chain in her chest. She felt Conrad's agonizing pain, his desperate struggle just to remain standing. Hendrik wasn't just insulting her, he was publicly betting on Conrad's death. He was a vulture circling a dying lion. Rowan didn't look down. She didn't flinch. She stepped forward, moving away from Conrad's side, deliberately placing herself between the dying king and his challenger. "I am Rowan of Oakhaven," she said. Her voice wasn't a roar. It was clear-sharp and carried the cold, unforgiving edge of a winter river. "I did not come here for a crown. I came here to ensure my pack does not starve." She unbuckled the silver-studded leather bracer on her left wrist. She let it drop to the stone floor with a loud, heavy clatter. Gasps echoed through the front rows. Rowan held up her arm, exposing the blackened, necrotic flesh of the bite mark, the poison veins stark against her pale skin. "Your high-born females choked on the rot," Rowan said, locking eyes with Hendrik, letting her own fierce, desperate will push back against his aura. Their blood was too rich, too sheltered. They died because they didn't know how to survive. "I do." She lowered her arm, staring Hendrik down, until the massive man finally, reluctantly, broke eye contact, looking at the floor. "The bond holds," Rowan stated to the silent room, her voice echoing off the stone pillars. "The king remains. If anyone wishes to test the strength of his anchor, step forward now. Or sit down and remember your place." The hall remained dead silent. No one moved. Behind her she felt a shift in the bond. The agonizing pain was still there, but beneath it, burning, bright and sudden, was a fierce, protective surge of absolute approval. "Sit, Hendrik," Conrad ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Hendrik bowed his head. "My king, my queen. He stepped back into the crowd. Rowan turned back to Conrad. He was looking at her, his golden eyes glowing in the firelight. He offered his hand. She took it, the iron chain of the bond humming between them, and together they sat on the thrones of the northern keep. The battle for the night was won, but as she looked out at the sea of calculating faces, Rowan knew the war for their survival had just begun. Rowan was tearing the meat off a roasted pheasant with her bare hands when the keep's lawmaster finally spoke. His name was Gideon. He was a frail, hunched man with ink-stained fingers and eyes like watered-down milk. He had spent the last 3 hours pulling crumbling, dust-choked ledgers from the highest shelves of the king's private study, muttering to himself in a language Rowan didn't understand. "It is not a natural rot, my king," Gideon said, dropping a heavy, leather-bound tome onto the oak table. Dust exploded into the air, dancing in the shafts of grey morning light. "It is a blood curse, a parasite woven from dark magic." Rowan swallowed a mouthful of cold bird wiping grease from her chin with the back of her wrist. She hadn't stopped eating since the council meeting 3 days ago. Her body was a furnace burning out of control. Greta brought her plates of venison, heavily buttered root vegetables, and thick stews every 4 hours. Rowan ate it all, yet her dresses were growing looser. The iron chain of the bond in her chest was a constant, greedy siphon, pulling her caloric energy straight into Conrad's deteriorating veins. Conrad sat by the window. He was watching the courtyard below his jaw, locked in a rigid line. He looked slightly better than the day of the bonding. The fever sweat was gone, and the black veins had retreated from his neck, pooling darkly around his collarbone. But the improvement was an illusion. He was simply drinking her life to mask his death. "I know it is a blood curse, Gideon." Conrad rasped, his voice tight with lingering pain. "I felt the witch cast it when she drove the bone knife into my thigh. I need to know how to break it. That is the complication." Gideon sighed, flipping carefully through the brittle yellowed pages. A standard hex requires a counterspell. A blood curse requires the blood of the caster. The magic is tethered to her heartbeat. As long as she breathes, the rot will continue to eat you. And by extension. He glanced nervously at Rowan. "Your anchor." Rowan looked down at her left arm. The heavy leather bracer was back in place, hiding the necrotic tissue. The jagged purple bruising hadn't spread, but it hadn't healed either. It throbbed constantly, a dull, aching rhythm that mirrored Conrad's pulse. "So we find the witch," Rowan said. She reached for an apple, snapping a large bite out of it. "Where is she?" "The Borderlands," Conrad answered, turning his golden eyes toward her. The guilt in his gaze was suffocating. He hated this. He hated being weak, and he hated dragging a teenage girl into his grave. "She is a mercenary, paid by a rival pack to cripple the northern keep before the harsh winter sets in. My scouts tracked her scent to the jagged peaks of the crag, but the trail went cold." "Send more scouts." Rowan said, her mouth full. "I cannot send the vanguard," Conrad replied, leaning heavily on his wooden cane as he pushed himself up from the windowsill. "Hendrik commands them. He knelt at the council, but a bowed head does not mean a loyal heart. If I order the vanguard out of the keep, Hendrik will take them, but he will not look for the witch. He will wait in the mountains for me to die, returning only to claim an empty throne." Rowan stopped chewing. The raw politics of the keep were a brutal, inescapable math. "You are a hostage in your own castle." "We both are," Conrad corrected quietly. He limped across the room, the heavy thud of his cane echoing off the stone walls. When he reached the table, he didn't look at the book. He looked at her. He reached out his large, calloused hand, gently wrapping around her left forearm, right over the leather bracer. The moment his skin touched the leather, the tether in Rowan's chest hummed a deep, resonant vibration that made her breath catch. The phantom pain of his ruined legs briefly spiked in her own nerves, followed immediately by a rush of his profound, desperate gratitude. "You are wasting away, Rowan," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Your face is hollow. You eat enough for 3 grown men, but my magic is starving you." "I am fine," she lied, pulling her arm back. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the half-eaten apple down. "My brother is safe. I will do what I have to do. It is not about a transaction anymore." Conrad said, a flash of frustration cracking his stoic facade. "If the witch is not dead by the first deep snowfall, your heart will give out. The bond will literally drain you to death to keep me breathing." The silence in the study grew heavy. Gideon suddenly found the spine of his book incredibly fascinating, turning his back to give them a sliver of privacy. Rowan looked at the dying Alpha. The cynicism that had always been her armor felt thin and useless against the raw, unvarnished truth in his eyes. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man caught in a bear trap, bleeding out horrified that someone else had been caught in the jaws with him. "Then we find someone we can trust," Rowan said, her voice steadying. "If the Vanguard is corrupt, who is left?" Conrad's jaw tightened. "There is one. Kyle. He was my lead tracker before the Blight took my legs. He was exiled by the Council last moon cycle on trumped-up charges of insubordination. Hendrik wanted him gone." "Where is he?" "The lower dungeons," Conrad said grimly, waiting for the spring thaw to be executed. Rowan stood up. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the room tilting dangerously. She gripped the edge of the heavy oak table until the wood bit into her palms and the world leveled out. Conrad took a sharp step forward, his hand hovering near her elbow, but he didn't touch her. He knew the contact would only drain her further. "Greta gave me a map of the keep," Rowan said, taking a slow, measured breath. "I know where the dungeons are. Rowan, no. You are too weak to navigate the lower levels alone. A king cannot sneak into his own dungeon to free a prisoner," she said, looking him dead in the eye. "But a queen, taking a confused, miserable walk in the dark, they will just think I am lost. Write a decree. Give Kyle a royal pardon. I will bring him to you." Conrad stared at her. The golden amber of his eyes shifted, darkening with a complex mix of reluctance and deep, reluctant awe. "You are a stubborn, foolish creature. I am a survivor," Rowan corrected flatly. "Write the pardon, Conrad, or start digging my grave." The lower dungeons smelled of saltpeter-old urine and wet iron. It was a suffocating, lightless labyrinth beneath the foundation of the keep, completely devoid of the roaring hearths that kept the upper floors bearable. Rowan wore a heavy, dark woolen cloak over her dress, a lit tallow candle in one hand, and Conrad's sealed parchment tucked securely into her bodice. The damp cold gnawed at her bones. Her energy was dangerously low. She had eaten a massive bowl of porridge before descending, but the iron chain in her chest was pulling relentlessly. Conrad was having a bad night. The pain radiating through the bond was a vicious, jagged rhythm, meaning the Blight was actively fighting his magic. She followed the damp, sloping corridor, counting the iron-barred doors. She reached the 7th cell. The torchlight from the main hall didn't reach this deep. It was a tomb. "Kale," she whispered into the pitch black of the cell. A rusty chain clinked softly in the darkness. A low, guttural growl followed, vibrating through the iron bars. "Who asks?" The voice was cracked raw from disuse. "The king's anchor," Rowan said, stepping closer to the bars, lifting the candle to cast a weak, yellow circle of light into the cell. A man sat on a bed of rotting straw. His clothes were rags, his face obscured by a thick, matted beard and long, filthy hair. But his eyes caught the candlelight. They were the pale, piercing blue of glacier ice. "The Oakhaven tribute!" Kyle rasped, a bitter amusement in his tone. "Hendrik's guards talk loudly when they are bored. They said the king married a peasant ghost who is already half dead." "They aren't entirely wrong," Rowan said dryly. She pulled the parchment from her dress. "But I am alive enough to hold a royal pardon. Conrad needs you. There is a blood witch in the crag. If you hunt her down and bring me her heart, you have your life back." Kyle didn't move. "Hendrik holds the keys to this block. A piece of paper won't open this iron." "I brought a heavy rock," Rowan said deadpan. "I figured I could smash the lock." Kyle stared at her for a long second before letting out a dry, hacking bark of laughter. "Goddess you really are from the mud. Let me see the seal." Rowan stepped directly up to the bars, reaching her hand through the cold iron to pass him the parchment. It happened in absolute silence. No footsteps, no warning growl, just the sudden terrifying shift in the air behind her. Rowan's instincts, honed by years of dodging drunken trappers in Oakhaven, flared a fraction of a second before the attack. She dropped the candle and threw her weight sideways. A heavy iron blade struck the stone bars exactly where her neck had been throwing off a shower of orange sparks. The candle hit the wet floor and snuffed out. Absolute, suffocating darkness crashed over them. Rowan hit the damp stone floor hard, her shoulder screaming in protest. A heavy boot slammed into her ribs, knocking the wind out of her in a violent rush. She gasped, rolling wildly in the dark as the attacker lunged again. "Bitch!" a voice hissed. It was a keep guard. The smell of cheap ale and stale sweat rolled off him. Hendrik's man. Rowan scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the slimy stone. She wasn't a warrior. She had no sword, no training. But she had spent her life fighting for scraps, and she knew how to play dirty. The guard grabbed her ankle, yanking her brutally backward. Rowan screamed, twisting her body. She kicked out with her free foot, aiming blind, and felt her heel connect solidly with a kneecap. The man grunted, his grip loosening just enough for her to tear free. In her chest, the bond exploded. The rusted iron chain didn't just hum, it seared. Conrad was feeling her panic. The conduit flooded with a chaotic, terrifying surge of raw alpha fury. It hit Rowan's bloodstream like a jolt of lightning, clearing the dizziness flooding her exhausted muscles with desperate borrowed adrenaline. She didn't run. She lunged forward in the dark. Her hands found his leather cuirass, sliding up to his throat. The guard swore, swinging a heavy fist that clipped her jaw, snapping her head back. Blood filled her mouth, hot and metallic. Rowan ignored it. She dug her thumbs savagely into the soft hollow of his throat, pressing with everything she had, her nails breaking against his skin. He dropped his dagger to claw at her hands, but Rowan shifted her weight, pinning him against the iron bars of Kyle's cell. "Kyle!" She screamed, her voice cracking. A hand shot out from between the iron bars. Kyle's massive, filthy fingers wrapped around the guard's hair. With a brutal, wordless roar, the prisoner yanked backward. The guard's head slammed violently into the iron bars. Once. Twice. The man went entirely limp, sliding down the bars to crumple on the wet stone floor. Rowan collapsed beside him, her chest heaving, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the stones. Her jaw throbbed in time with her racing heart. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. A heavy, terrifying sound shattered the silence of the corridor. It was a wet, ragged roar, half man, half beast, echoing down the stone stairs. Footsteps pounded against the stone, irregular, heavy and frantic. A torch flared in the stairwell, casting wild, dancing shadows against the walls. Conrad rounded the corner. He was a terrifying sight. He was barefoot, wearing only his dark linen trousers and an open shirt. He had no cane. The effort of running on his ruined, necrotic legs had stripped the color completely from his face. Blood leaked from his nose, and the black veins on his chest were pulsing violently. His golden eyes were wide, blown out, glowing with a lethal, unhinged light. He hit the floor of the dungeon, his ruined legs giving out instantly. He crashed to his knees on the hard stone, dropping the torch. Rowan pushed herself off the dead guard and crawled across the wet floor toward him. Conrad didn't look at the corpse. He grabbed Rowan's shoulders, his hands bruising in their intensity, pulling her roughly against his chest. His breathing was a ragged, wet rattle. Through the bond, Rowan felt his terror a cold, hollow void that was completely contrary to the fierce alpha he projected to the world. He had felt her dying. He had felt the tether snap tight, and it had nearly broken his mind. "I have him!" Rowan gasped into his shoulder, her bloody hands gripping his shirt. "Conrad, I have the tracker." Conrad pressed his face into her hair, his massive frame shaking violently as the adrenaline left him the agony of his legs returning with a vengeance. He closed his eyes, holding his fragile, bloody anchor on the floor of the dungeon, fully realizing that the war was no longer just about his throne. It was about her life. Kyle did not ask for a horse. He took a heavy iron broadsword, a thick bearskin cloak, and 3 days' worth of dried venison. He slipped out of the keep through the postern gate, while the blizzard howled, swallowed instantly by the blinding white of the northern mountains. Then the waiting began. It was a quiet, suffocating kind of violence. Time became a physical weight pressing down on Rowan's chest. The keep was completely snowed in. The massive oak doors of the great hall were bolted shut against drifts that reached the lower windows. Inside, the air grew stagnant, smelling of wood smoke, anxious sweat, and the creeping, undeniable scent of a dying alpha. By the 5th day, Rowan could no longer walk without leaning on the stone walls. The bond was starving her. Her collarbones sharply protruded against her skin, and her eyes were sunk deep into dark, bruised hollows. She spent her days sitting in the heavy wooden chair beside Conrad's bed, holding his hand. It wasn't out of affection. It was a desperate mechanical transfer of life. Whenever she let go, his breathing would stutter and stop. Conrad was rarely conscious. The black rot had crawled past his collarbone, wrapping around his throat like a dark, strangling vine. When he did wake, his golden eyes were clouded with agony, his jaw clamped shut to keep from screaming. The keep knew. You cannot hide the decay of a king from a pack of wolves. Hendrik stopped pretending on the morning of the 6th day. He did not come to the king's chambers himself. He sent 4 of his vanguard massive men in heavy, boiled leather to stand guard at the base of the stairs leading to the royal wing. They claimed it was for the king's protection. It was a blockade. Hendrik was sealing them in to die. They are controlling the flow of food. Greta said, her voice hard, as she set a meager bowl of watered-down oats on the bedside table. "The kitchens are under Hendrik's command. This is all I could smuggle past the stairs. He is starving you out, Rowan. He knows the bond is eating your reserves." Rowan looked at the bowl. It was grey and pathetic. She pushed it away. "Give it to Gideon. He needs his strength to translate the rest of that grimoire. You have to eat!" Greta hissed, her severe facade finally cracking. Tears of pure, exhausted frustration welled in her eyes. "If your heart stops, his heart stops. If I eat that, I buy us another hour," Rowan said flatly. She looked at Conrad. His skin was the colour of old ash. The tether in her chest, once a heavy iron chain, was stretched incredibly thin. It was vibrating a high-pitched, frantic hum that gave her a constant splitting migraine. "An hour won't save us. We need Kale. Kale is dead in the snow." A new voice echoed from the doorway. Rowan turned her head. Hendrik stood in the archway, his massive frame filling the space. He had bypassed his own guards. He wasn't wearing his formal council tunic, he was wearing his armor. "Get out!" Greta snarled, stepping between the bed and the beta. Hendrik backhanded her. It was a casual, brutal strike. Greta hit the stone floor hard, sliding into the hearth. Rowan didn't scream. She didn't flinch. The cynical pragmatism that had kept her alive in Oakhaven went ice-cold in her veins. She slowly stood up from the wooden chair. Her legs trembled violently, threatening to give out, but she locked her knees. "Treason is an ugly colour on you, Hendrik." Rowan said, her voice a raspy whisper. Hendrik laughed, a low, rumbling sound that shook the dust from the ceiling rafters. He walked slowly into the room, looking at Conrad's unmoving body on the bed. "It isn't treason to bury a corpse, little bird. It is sanitation. He's gone. The rot has taken his wolf." He turned his cold eyes to Rowan. "And you? Look at you. A brittle twig snapping in the winter wind. Did you really think peasant blood could hold the weight of the northern keep? It held off your high-born bitches." Rowan said softly. Hendrik's jaw tightened. He drew a heavy hunting knife from his belt. The steel gleamed in the firelight. "The council meets in the Great Hall in 1 hour. I will tell them the king succumbed to the blight in his sleep. I will tell them the sorrow was too much for his fragile mate, and she threw herself from the battlements." He took a step toward her. Rowan didn't back away. She reached down to the bed, her fingers wrapping around Conrad's cold, heavily veined hand. She squeezed. "Wake up!" She screamed into the bond. "I have nothing left. Wake up!" The tether snapped tight. The vibration stopped. Conrad's eyes snapped open. They weren't cloudy. They were a brilliant, blinding, monstrous gold. The alpha aura that exploded into the room didn't just push. It crushed. It was a physical shockwave of raw, unadulterated power, fueled by Rowan's desperate, burning adrenaline. Hendrik gasped, his knees buckling under the sheer weight of the dominance rolling off the bed. The heavy hunting knife slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the stone. Conrad didn't sit up. He couldn't. But his voice, though a ragged rasp, carried the weight of a falling mountain. "You dare bear steel in my chamber!" Conrad whispered. Hendrik was forced to the floor, his hands pressing against the stone as his inner wolf submitted violently to the alpha. His nose began to bleed. "You are dead!" Hendrik choked out, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "You have no magic left." "I have my anchor." Conrad snarled. A deafening crash shattered the tension in the room. It didn't come from the chamber. It came from outside. A heavy, booming thud that echoed up from the courtyard, followed by the sound of splintering wood and the screaming of the wind. Hendrik's head jerked toward the window. Heavy, frantic footsteps thundered up the stone stairwell, blowing past Hendrik's vanguard. The heavy oak doors of the chamber smashed open. It was Kyle. He was covered in frostbite, his beard caked in bloody ice, his armor torn to shreds. He looked like a man who had walked through hell. In his left hand he held a heavy burlap sack. It was dripping a thick, black, foul-smelling liquid onto the cleaned stones. Kyle locked eyes with Rowan. He didn't say a word. He simply tossed the sack across the room. It landed at Rowan's feet with a wet, heavy thud. The burlap fell away, revealing the severed head of a woman with milky white eyes and tribal tattoos carved into her cheeks. "The witch," Kyle gasped, collapsing against the doorframe. "The crag is clear." Rowan looked down at the head. Then she felt it. The iron chain in her chest didn't just loosen. It shattered. The release of the blood curse was not gentle. It was violent. The moment the parasitic magic died with the witch, the black veins on Conrad's neck instantly stopped pulsing. A sickening, wet tearing sound filled the room as the necrotic tissue began to rapidly slough away, replaced by raw pink skin as his dormant, suppressed wolf healing exploded into overdrive. Conrad let out a guttural, agonizing roar. His back arched off the bed, his muscles corded tight, twisting as the unnatural rot was forcibly purged from his marrow. Rowan fell to her knees beside the bed. Without the constant draining siphon of the curse pulling her energy, her own body went into shock. The world spun in sickening circles. She gagged, clutching her stomach as a rush of dizzying relief flooded her veins. "No, no, no," Hendrik muttered, scrambling backward towards the door. Conrad's roaring stopped. The heavy, ragged breathing smoothed out. Slowly, deliberately, the king swung his legs over the side of the bed. The black veins were gone. The grey pallor had vanished, replaced by the flushed, healthy colour of a predator. He stood up. He didn't stumble. He didn't lean on a cane. He was massive. He was whole. Conrad looked down at Hendrik, who was now crawling backward on the floor, pathetic and broken. "You commanded the vanguard to block my door," Conrad said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated the glass in the windows. "You starved my household. You drew steel on my mate." "My king, I sought only to preserve the keep." Hendrik stammered, his chin trembling. "The rot was making you weak. I was protecting the pack." "You were protecting your own ambition," Conrad said coldly. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He simply stepped forward, grabbed Hendrik by the thick leather collar of his armor, and lifted the massive beta off the floor with one arm. Hendrik choked his boots, kicking uselessly in the air. "I am the North," Conrad stated softly, looking directly into Hendrik's terrified eyes. "And the North does not tolerate treason." With a brutal, effortless twist of his wrist, Conrad snapped Hendrik's neck. The sickening crack echoed loudly. Conrad dropped the heavy corpse onto the floor. He didn't spare it a second glance. He turned immediately to Rowan. She was still on her knees, staring at the body, her breathing shallow. Conrad dropped to the floor in front of her. He reached out his massive, warm hands, gently framing her face. The fever was gone from his touch. The frantic, terrified edge of a dying man had vanished. "Rowan," he murmured, his thumb brushing a tear she hadn't realized she was shedding off her hollow cheek. She looked up into his golden eyes. For the first time since she had walked into his chamber, the bond between them wasn't a parasitic chain of suffering. It was a warm, steady, golden pulse. It felt like standing in a sunlit river. She could feel his immense strength, his profound gratitude, and beneath it all a deep, staggering awe directed entirely at her. "It's gone," Rowan whispered, her voice cracking. "It's gone," Conrad confirmed, pulling her against his broad chest. He buried his face in her hair, holding her tightly. "Because of you. Because you refused to let me die. I did it for the venison." Rowan choked out a cynical, exhausted laugh bubbling out of her throat. Conrad let out a deep, booming laugh that warmed the freezing room. "Then you shall have all the stags in the north, my fierce, stubborn queen." 3 weeks later, the deep freeze broke. The sun sat high in a clear, blue sky, turning the snow-capped peaks into blinding diamonds. The courtyard of the Wolf's Keep was alive with noise. Blacksmiths' hammered iron children ran between the massive dire wolves, and merchants hauled carts of winter grain. Rowan stood on the high balcony overlooking the valley, the heavy fur-lined cloak of the queen resting easily on her shoulders. Her cheeks had filled out her skin, glowing with a healthy, vibrant color. The necrotic bite mark on her wrist had healed into a silver crescent scar, a badge of honor that no one in the keep dared look at with anything less than absolute reverence. Below, Kyle, newly appointed as the vanguard commander, was drilling the guard. The pack was united. The terror was gone. Warm arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Conrad rested his chin on the top of her head, pulling her back against his chest. His scent was crisp pine, and wood smoke the smell of safety. "Elder Alden sent a raven from Oakhaven this morning," Conrad said softly. "The hunting was good. Your brother has grown 2 inches and learned to string a bow." Rowan smiled, leaning into his warmth. The river water of her past felt a lifetime away. She had been sold as a sacrifice to a dying king. But standing here, watching the snow melt in the valleys, she knew the truth. She hadn't been a lamb led to slaughter. She had been the wolf that kept the wolves at bay. The North belonged to them, and winter had finally passed. The curse is broken, and the Northern Keep has a true queen at its helm. Rowan's journey from a starving peasant to a fierce, unyielding ruler proves that sometimes the greatest strength comes from those who have nothing left to lose. If you loved this deeply emotional, gritty medieval werewolf drama, hit that like button and share this video with a friend who loves dark romance. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next epic original story. Drop a comment below and tell us your favorite moment from Rowan and Conrad's journey.